Welcome to the Unlist. Today we're talking about Calvin Klein's CK1. Now I did a short on this a while back, so I don't want to touch upon the smell in too much detail because I covered it in that short pretty well, and also CK1 is not a fragrance that you can really go at length on concerning the actual scent of it. It is such a monolithic smell, a singular accord, if you will, built up by so many, according to the note pyramid, so many different materials that make up the smell of CK1, but ultimately the result is just a single blob of scent that it produces. And there's a certain beauty in that because part of what makes it so successful is the fact that it's so abstract and detached from nature. In order to be what it is, which is a shared fragrance that doesn't impart gender at all, it almost has to be divorced from nature, right? Since gender and sex are both parts of the human condition. So if you make a fragrance that has callbacks in any way to the human condition, you're going to automatically put it in one camp or the other in the minds of people. I mean, there are people who won't obviously see it that way, but it's just a problem whenever you link to the natural world. Then you create a link to experiences, and those experiences in the natural world, because we live in the world, right? You link to the natural world, you link to people's experiences in the world, and then those experiences are going to inform them that the fragrance is masculine or feminine or a mixture of the two. But to be completely devoid of gender, which is what it seeks to do, and I think it does successfully, it has to be divorced from the natural world and be divorced from the human condition. So, CK1 is perhaps most remembered as the fragrance that stuck the landing. And what I mean by that is there are a lot of things that have tried over the years to be shared, tried to be either unisex or, like I said, just sexless. People consider CK1 a unisex fragrance, and it is, for pragmatism's sake, a unisex fragrance, but it's also genderless in its design. Past attempts at a shared fragrance, at a unisex fragrance, were not genderless. A lot of times, older attempts at a fragrance like this would usually be a ratio. They would try to go as evenly split 50-50 as they could between masculine qualities and feminine qualities. They tried very hard to split hairs and find that compromise in the middle. And unfortunately, that's, once again, like I said, you're calling back to the natural world. You're calling back to human experience. And people are going to say, well, this feels more feminine to me. This feels more masculine to me. And that's just, like I said, you're setting yourself up for failure when you do that. So a lot of those shared fragrances that came out, and I don't want to go too much into gender in fragrance. I've made videos on that already. You are free to watch them. But the quick recap crash course version of that discussion is that when perfumes were high-end luxuries that few could afford, they weren't gendered because it didn't matter what your situation was downstairs. All that mattered was, do you have the money, right? It's like the Troydarian from episode 1. He's like, Republican credits don't work on me, only money. So it's like, gender doesn't work on me, only money. If you have the money, you can smell like flowers and you can smell like woods or whatever the hell you want to smell like because you're rich. If you don't have money, then you smell like a bar of soap. And that's it. And be thankful. So gender didn't really come around until fragrances became more widespread due to manufacturing and chemistry. And then guys wanting their own. And then guys wanting their own, once more men were wearing fragrance, meant that suddenly all of the fragrances that were not explicitly for him, they weren't pour homme, they weren't uomo, they weren't pour monsieur, they were for women. If it didn't say it was for men, then by default it was for women, even if it wasn't true. Even if Shalimar and Laura Blue and Mitsoko and all the other ones were not necessarily just for women. They were probably marketed to women because the primary consumer of perfumes was women, really. But they weren't explicitly just for ladies. But by the time you had Caron Pour Homme and Mouchoir de Monsieur and all that stuff, you know, those were very much cut and dried for men. So that made everything else, like I said, by default, everything else was for women. Ever since that bifurcation of the market, there has been attempts to create shared fragrances because twice as many people will buy the bottle if it's for both people in a relationship, right? In a marriage or whatever. The guy and the girl will both buy it. You know, two guys and two girls obviously can also buy it, but you get my point. So the shared fragrances started as early as right around World War II, like Arôme Toi by d'Orsay was originally marketed as a shared fragrance. There were a couple of Lanvin fragrances that were marketed as shared scents, okay? Some of the early sport scents were also shared, okay? But a lot of those didn't stick the landing, which is what I said. The reason this is so successful is after 70, 80 years of trying, this is the one that finally did all the somersaults and then boom, stuck the landing and made a huge impact. There was a more prominent flare-up of these fragrances around the 60s and 70s because we had Woodstock, we had the free love movement, you know, all that stuff. And people were sharing things at that time. Musk oils were very popular. People were sharing the musk oils. So there were a couple of shared fragrances like Alyssa Ashley, which famously had a his and hers sex logo like twined together on the box, right, denoting that it's for both. And then you had some things like Eau de Campagne by Sisley, Eau de Roche, Eau de Rochas was a successor, Eau de Petou, Eau de Lancôme. There were a lot of those, okay? And most of them were successful in a minor way, but a lot of them were not, you know. Eau Libre was discontinued famously after a couple of years in the market by Yves Saint Laurent. So Ho Hong by Balenciaga was successful, but ultimately was marketed for men. See, a lot of these that started off, okay, as shared became one or the other. So Eau de Lancôme ultimately became women's fragrance. Ho Hong ultimately became men's fragrance. But they were initially shared when they were launched. So you fast forward to the 90s, and Calvin Klein takes a stab at it, and they managed to break through. And it's, like I said in the beginning of this video, it has to do with the fact that they removed this fragrance from nature. They divorced it from the natural world. They made a fragrance so abstract, so synthetic, so anonymous that it could only be androgynous. It couldn't be anything else. There wasn't a choice. And you can chalk it up to Alberto Morillas and Harry Fremont, the perfumers for CK1 if you want to. Or maybe it was a particularly well-written brief, whatever the case may be. Maybe it was a combination of all those. Maybe it was also the fact that Calvin Klein was known for its abstract, synthetic, futuristic style. I mean, Obsession, Eternity, okay, Escape. These were all very abstract fragrances, very synthetic fragrances. Calvin Klein's whole shtick was being in the future, right? So CK1 fit right along into that. Now, the thing that made CK1 different from those perfumes is the fact that all of those still had some callback to nature. Obsession was mostly about amber, right? Obsession was mostly about amber. Eternity was mostly about aldehydes for the women's version and lavender for the men's version. Escape was mostly about tropical fruit notes. So these perfumes still had some latch into the natural world. They still had some hook. CK1 did not. You could argue that jasmine hedione plays a large role in this fragrance. You could also argue that hydroxycitronellol also plays a large role in this fragrance. And those are naturally derived materials, yes, but they are still synthetic in the abstract. Hedione, divorced from the rest of the jasmine accord, just smells like white fluffiness, clean. Okay. Uh, the hydroxycitronellol accord in here, also the other white musk choices that are used in here. The aldehydic top notes, the citruses, it's all blended in such a way that nothing resembles anything that you would find. You don't smell lemon, you don't smell jasmine, you don't smell tea, you don't smell tonka. You just smell this fluffy, white, clean, soapy, sharp cloud of just nothing that smells pleasant and amiable and smells like you have good hygiene. And women, men, non-binary folks, everyone likes to be clean, I should hope. So therein is the reason why this fragrance stuck the landing, is they found that universal appeal while also being divorced from anything that could be related to a gender norm. You have no way to call back to a gender norm, and you can't say this is women, this is men, this is whatever. People still did. Make no mistake, when CK1 first hit the market in 1994, there were a lot of people who were really insecure about this. There were women who didn't want to wear it because guys wore it. There were guys who didn't want to wear it because their girlfriends liked it. There were people who thought it was too radical, right? You see that now with things. People thought it was too radical. They thought it was the beginning of the end times, that it was the decline of Western civilization. How dare you make a fragrance that doesn't explicitly denote gender? And I'm like, oh my God, here we go. It's perfume. It's perfume. It's smelly water in a bottle. Okay? Napoleon didn't care. Why should you care? He didn't care when he was filling bathtubs full of cologne. Okay? He didn't care. So why should you care? So it's silly. And CK1 also got caught up in controversy because the ads showed women and men wearing the same clothes, the same baggy pants, the same like A shirts, the same generic white nondescript clothing, and shaved heads or short hair. So it just, people read too much political stuff, psyop stuff. They read too much brain rot. And it's funny because in the 90s we didn't have all these crazy hardcore think tanks like we do now. We didn't have all these super dyed-in-the-wool scary people like we do now, because they didn't have the same online gathering places. Like they didn't have 4chan and stuff like that, and Reddit and places where people could get radicalized. These places didn't exist online. So these days having that kind of reaction is kind of just normal. You expect there to be that fringe element that loses their minds, right, over something like this. So to have people do that back then, when the internet was still a relatively new phenomenon, to have a perfume basically radicalize people in a weird culture war thing back in 94, when we were all still listening to grunge and like driving Ford Tauruses, it's kind of silly. It's kind of silly. But that knee-jerk negative reaction did instigate Calvin Klein to expand the concept. If this had been universally loved and everyone had just accepted it, we would probably only still have this one. We would probably, like Chanel No. 5, okay, right? Like a lot of monolithic fragrances that don't change much over the years. If this had become the new Chanel No. 5 for its generation, we wouldn't have a ton of flankers. We would still just have this one. But because of the backlash, because of the outcry, you got alternative versions of CK1 to try and capture the people who didn't accept it. And the first one of those was CKB in 1996. That one's a bit more male-coded because that was them trying to appeal to the guys who were insecure about it. They didn't like CK1. It was too floral. It was too fresh. It didn't feel manly enough. So they made a soapier, more fougere-based fragrance. It still had unisex appeal. It was still genderless. It had apricot and fig notes in it. It was crazy. It was like a peach fougere. It's a really strange fragrance. But I like it. I like CKB. It's probably not as popular as CK1, but it is like a unisex barbershop scent. And the guys who were, just like I said, on the fence about this, they were able to wear that one instead. And Calvin Klein made money. Then for a while, once the controversy died down and the acceptance increased, then we started seeing imitators. Paco Rabanne famously put out Paco, which was one of the earliest of the imitators, an attempt to capture the unisex market. Then we would see all throughout the late 90s and the early 2000s, every brand under the sun would have their own take on a unisex with a we or a us or a you and I kind of theme, right? To show the shared nature of it. And they would all have similar, nondescript, just blanket, fresh kind of smells to them to try and capture that same genderless, devoid kind of vibe. And then, interestingly enough, CK1 would end up becoming so successful, it was temporarily separated from Calvin Klein into its own clothing range. And we had CK1 jeans and CK1 shirts and CK1 everything. That didn't last super long, and eventually it got folded back into the main lines. And even though they still put CK1 logos on things, there is no separate division anymore of CK1 clothes, but for a while there was, due to the success. And then one last thing was all of the high-end brands that were emerging in the late 90s and the early 2000s, they saw opportunity to also create similar unisex fragrances, but for a more elevated palette for a higher-end clientele. So we would see stuff like Eau de New York by Bond Number 9. Okay, we would see lots of unisex entries from brands like Penhaligon. They would come out with Castile in 96. Okay. We would see Creed create a bunch of unisex fragrances, right? Really like nipping on the heels of CK1. Creed had Milsim Imperial and Silver Mountain Water, both in 95. Two back-to-back unisex releases in 1995 with Milsim Imperial, Silver Mountain Water. Then they would have Royal Water in 97. And they would keep that trend going. Into the 2000s, they would have several similar unisex fresh fragrances. They would have Original Vetiver. They would have Original Santal. Even though Original Santal smells just like Mont Blanc Individuel, which is a men's market fragrance, but it was marketed as unisex by Creed. Whatever. Pure White Cologne was a super ultra high-end fragrance that they came out with that was also unisex based on a traditional eau de cologne structure. Thierry Mugler had Mugler Cologne. Mugler Cologne was another one that was unisex. And the list goes on and on and on and on and on. Eventually, we would see stuff from Xerjoff with like the 1776 line, Renaissance, Ninfeo Mayo by Annick Goutal, Casamarati with the Mephisto range, which Xerjoff ended up folding that together too. And now it's just kind of like it's run rampant. You've got these white floral type nondescript fresh fragrances at every price point. You can go all the way up to like $500 and then all the way down to $50. And the whole like spread in between. That's all thanks to the success of CK1, which would continue to pump out flankers. You know, we would have CK1 Scene, CK1 Electric. What's really funny is eventually they would experiment with creating his and hers CK1 fragrances, which defeats the purpose of it being unisex, but there was a shock line, CK1 Shock, for him and for her. They were separate gendered fragrances. Then they would have the CK Into You, which were also separate gendered fragrances that were part of the line. Then we would see CK Free. So, and it just goes on. And then they would have CK All, CK1 Gold, Platinum, CK Everyone, which was kind of silly. That one, CK Everyone. So, and it's just they just milk it now. They milk every single penny they can out of this range because it's still successful. Although it might surprise you to learn that where CK1 has kind of fallen off in the US and Europe, it's picked up in Asia. The CK1 line, the CK1 fragrances, very popular in China, very popular in Asia, very popular in India, very popular in that whole South Pacific area, Malaysia. That whole segment of the world likes Calvin Klein in general. Calvin Klein does very well over there, but in particular, the CK1 fragrances. And I don't know what it is about them. I'm not a cultural, socio-political scientist. I can't explain to you why Chinese people like CK1, but they do. So this became old hat here in the States. This has probably also become old hat in a lot of Europe too. But it's going strong over in Asia. So a lot of people wear CK1. A lot of folks wear Calvin Klein in general, like I said. But the torch has been passed, and now all the CK1, the bulk of CK1 sells over there. So, that pretty much wraps it up. It's not a complex thing, man. It's just all of the other shared fragrances that came before this one. None of them stuck the landing because they went about it incorrectly. They tried to compromise between a his and hers fragrance, where CK1 was like neither nor. We're just going to make a fragrance that smells as nondescript, clean, and fresh and pleasant as we can. And then we'll just let God sort them out. Like the old saying goes, we'll just throw it out there. Androgynous marketing, white t-shirts, white jeans, we'll make it smell like the most pleasant nothing you've ever smelled in your life. And we'll let y'all figure out what's up. And like I said, that's the one that stuck the landing, guys. And now here we are. 30 years later, here we are, and you may not catch this in the wild as often as you do some other things. This no longer turns up like BR540 does, but if you ever walk past somebody and you smell a fresh, clean, Hedione sort of based scent, and you don't know exactly what it is, could be this. Could be this, guys. All right. This has been The Unlist. Hope you enjoyed watching. Catch you next time.